So, as the presentation already reveals, we're going to talk today about science and emotions, which is a complex relationship, as we will go deeper into throughout the presentation. In this talk, we will on the one hand take a bit of a philosophical approach, in the sense that we will look at how some founding fathers in philosophy have influenced the way we perceive emotions in science today, but also the way we are going to think about science and emotions. We also will take a bit of an anthropological approach in the sense that we will look at science as a sort of subculture. So scientists, they also have their own culture and habits, and when we talk about science and emotions, we will think about science as also a culture. So this being said, the first thing that I would like to do is actually asking you, when I say science and emotion, I am wondering, before I go deeper into my findings, to see what your associations are. And to facilitate this, you have here 4 images, and I would like you to pick one of the images that depicts most of how you perceive science and emotion. And you can discuss with your neighbor for a minute which picture you pick and why.
Avete capito? Scegliete l'immagine che secondo voi più rappresenta il tema, scienza delle emozioni. Potete discuterne anche vicino a voi.
You can also pick one. I'm somebody I work with, so I have like a whole collection of cards who sometimes play games or do like now an exercise of picking one, and they often depict like issues in science to start conversations.
Seems to be a lot of discussion.
Yes, it works well because you can see different things.
It's like a Russian club.
Okay, so now I'm also curious to find out what you have been talking about. So I was wondering who picked the first image? Would you care to explain why you picked the first one?
Because if I think the relationship between science and emotion, I think like about the, I don't know the English name of the feeling that becomes molecules and posso ripetere?
Sì.
Immagino le sinapsi, i collegamenti di molecole varie.
He thinks about the connections, neural connections.
Okay, good. Thank you. Who picked the second one?
Numero 2.
Okay.
I think it represents how the sentiment that should drive science is care for everything.
Okay, so you associate it with taking care of things. Okay, good. Somebody else picked number 2? And had a different reason?
No, not really. It was a similar reason.
Okay.
I picked number 2 I don't know exactly the reason. Maybe because I associate with patience.
Okay.
Some science activities requires a lot of patience.
Okay, so care, patience, good. Okay, who picked the third one? Okay, a lot of people. Okay, somebody would like to tell why?
Well, we both choose it, just because of intuition, and then we reflect a little bit, and it's the only one who has some color.
Okay, good. Somebody else picked the third one, but had a different reason for it? No. Okay, who picked the fourth? Okay, care to tell why?
I don't know, because it's the most clear one, and it says that there's someone who is judging, and there is some people that's happy about what's going on.
Okay, so for you it has to do a bit with the judging part then.
I think so.
Okay, and I also saw somebody else raising their hand.
Yeah, I do, but I do not really wish to speak. This is
Okay.
what I'm saying. I didn't even notice the people of the background, but I do believe that sometimes science can be archaic in some sort of way, especially in the interpretation of things, because kind of limit the way we have to know things.
Okay, that's also, yeah, that's also a very interesting perspective. So different people already have different associations when they think of science and emotions. We will touch upon different of these elements that have been said. Now, before going further, I was wondering, what sounds for you the worst? Science with emotion or science without emotion? Who says, I think science with emotion is undesirable? Nobody. So everybody thinks science should have emotion. Okay, good. That's a bit unexpected even. Okay, and I will tell you why it's a bit unexpected, but really good, by the way. So there's actually have been a very troublesome relationship between science and emotions. And this is actually because science cares about objectivity and it wants to focus on reason. And if we see to some founding fathers in philosophy, well, let's first start with Plato, who is one of the first that came with an idea that reason should be detached and it should be pure without passion. And he uses this allegory of a charioteer, where the charioteer rules actually over emotions, appetites, a bit above chaos. So the charioteer, he actually wants to create order. Now you see two horses. One horse is going upwards, and that's the noble one. That's the one that wants to be uplifted. And the other one, the black horse, that's actually the unruly horse that is driven by desire and makes a descending movement. So what Plato now says, and this is like the beginning of an enlightenment idea, is that we should actually strive to tame these horses, to have a sort of order and reach towards the gods. So in this paradigm, we see that reason needs to govern emotions, because they can be chaotic and they are unruly. It's not the same as saying that we have to exclude emotions or destroy them, so that's not what he says. But if we would just let these horses rule, then there would be no direction. So there's need for control and order, and this is the beginning of a separation between reason, that stands for objectivity and control, and for emotion, which stands for subjectivity. Then there is a second philosophical father who actually made an even bigger divide, and that's Descartes, René Descartes. And here we talk about the Cartesian cut, So Descartes, he is famously known for separating the mind and the body. The body stands for the senses, for the emotions, and we now have the res cogitas and the res extensa. So there is a cut between emotion and reason, and this gap is actually unsolvable. So it's a difficult relationship. So what Descartes does is, while Plato, he really wants to control the horses, Descartes goes a bit even further, and he really wants to suppress the black horse. And this leads actually to the beginning of a type of disembodied rational scientist, which also gives way to a new line of thinking about the physical world, namely as something detached from us, because it's part of the material world, and which gives way to seeing it as a type of data. Then we have the third philosopher who had a big impact on the scientific tension between emotions and science, and that is Immanuel Kant. Now, he actually was the one who did an institutionalization of pure reason, which means that reason should be untouched about emotion. And we find a separation between pure and practical reason. So knowledge should be independent of all experiences and sense impressions, which means emotions and also the senses are something that we have to overcome. It's a type of obstacle and a type of noise that is an obstacle for pure reason. Now this gave way to modern science, how we understand it today, where truth comes from control, where there's a difference between subjectivity and objectivity, and where we try to remove messy feelings, messy noise, to get a better understanding. This is a type of scientific ideal. So the scientist is a detached observer who makes knowledge that should be untainted by subjectivity. So suppress emotions. And this raises the questions, so emotions are not needed. Is this what then is being implied? Well, if we think about no emotions, then we think about machines, of course. And then a question I would like to ask you: do machines better tasks without emotions? So, do machines perform the same tasks as people better because they have no emotions? Is this the ideal that we strive for? And as with the previous exercise, you can now discuss with your neighbor. You can pick one of the 4 images that presents best your position on this. So do you think machines can be better at pure reasoning and doing these kind of tasks because they are not driven by emotions?
La domanda è se le macchine sono più efficienti perché non provano emozioni, e come prima dovete scegliere which image better represents this idea of machines without emotions.
And it can be positive or negative, depending on what you think. Do you think machines can do a better job at thinking because they are not clouded by emotions? And you can think, for example, about AI, because it's also like a new evolution where people have very high expectations of what AI can do. So maybe ask yourself the question, do you think that AI can do a better job at some tasks than we can do? Okay. Did somebody pick the first one? Okay, would you like to tell why?
Of course, I picked the first one because I see on the right side a robot, which looks like something you can use to write and maybe create knowledge. But on the other side, on the left side, I see something that looks like a person. So basically, the person says like no to the knowledge created by a machine, which is a position. If you think about, are you in favor of outputs given by artificial intelligence or what is?
Okay, and so you also prefer not to put a machine on a higher level?
Yes, because in my experience it didn't work.
Okay, good.
Maybe I need more skills, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Who picked the second one? Okay, somebody wants to tell why?
Yes, I picked the second one because I think that machines are not generally better than humans. They are only better in some specific context because they lack of expression and sensitivity, and they do not understand what time and space are. So in this drawing, we can see a simple game of trees. And the machine gets it completely wrong because he doesn't know the implicit rules of the game.
Okay, thank you. And somebody else who picked this one who had another reason for it? No? Okay. Who picked the third one? Somebody care to elaborate?
Yeah, maybe because there is somebody who's trying to think like a machine who think in a really specific mode. I don't know, maybe the box in his head, and it's this, I don't know. But there is difficult because he is a person, so that's the trouble to try to work like a machine and not like a human.
Okay. And I saw other people who also picked 3. Okay.
I believe that it's very evocative because like it's a machine looking at itself in the mirror, and it reminds me of the perception, like a human being through emotion, like feel the world and made their own way, make things that are not always logical but are better than logical sometimes in some certain situation. And without that part of the conscience that we do have, even science has its own limits. Kind of reminding me that.
Okay, thank you. Somebody else with another reason?
It reminds me of the fact that artificial intelligence is simplified, so we can see what we want to see. It's like our mirror because every output is basically what we want to read. So our thing is in the mirror.
Okay, good. It's nice. But also, there are different perceptions on the second image. Who picked the fourth one? Okay, somebody wants to talk about it?
Yeah, it has to do with sorting. That's something that machines do quite well, sorting and mechanical, and of course looks like a mechanical task.
Okay. Somebody have a different reason for number 4? Okay, so that's nice, different reflections on the same topic. Well, I will link it now to a book that has been written called Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio, where in neurological research they actually found that this idea where machines, that reason and thinking, that this is actually something that works better without emotion, this is an illusion, because when they studied people who had no more access to emotion through brain injury, they actually noticed they also did not have the capacity anymore to reason effectively. So this emotion is actually very important to do good reasoning. So they can calculate, but they cannot decide. And that's also something that came up in the group. So emotion is not the opposite of reason, it's actually an energy that allows it to work. And he then draws a conclusion that we are not thinking machines that feel, but more like feeling machines that think. So it tells us what matters, that we actually need this emotion to start making decisions. So machines are really good at working effectively, producing a lot, but if we want to have reasoning and thinking, there should be something that can denote meaning and that can make decisions. Okay, so we talked about emotions in science. Now let's see about science communication. And this is a bit of an exception to the rule because very often, while in science itself, we want to stay as far away from subjectivity and emotions, and we want it to be very focused on objectivity. When you think of science communication to the public, very often emotions are seen as a way to establish connection. But if you think about it, when you say using emotions to get a connection, well, it is actually kind of instrumentalization of emotion. So here it functions as a way of doing persuasion and also of being effectively in doing something. Now, language is something that actually also requires emotion. So it's deeply connected because it shapes emotional experiences, the way you communicate. And on the other hand, to interpret language, you also need to be able to connect. At the same time, so there is a connection between language and emotion, we also see that language is very closely intertwined with reason. So we see science communication often as something that comes at the end of doing science, but it's actually not. Because everything about science is about communication. Very important in science is that you are able to articulate the knowledge you have. If you cannot articulate it, it will not be considered scientific knowledge. That's also why it's so difficult for scientists to describe or talk about tacit knowledge. So this description is actually very important in the scientific activity. And this has to do also with the roots of disciplines in science. When you hear the word logos, like in ecology, neurology, geology, sociology, in logos you both have reason but also words. So these two, actually in the sciences, they go hand in hand together. Now, there are some shortcomings when we think about descriptive language and being able to keep it clear from emotions. That's because speaking and writing actually, in order to be meaningful, it's not enough to think that you're just describing. Actually, Ogden and Richards, they developed the semantic triangle, where they analyze how actually words get meaning. And there's an interaction between somebody who is thinking, that somebody will be describing, and it corresponds with the thing it describes. This is a very difficult model if you read it in depth. I will not go further into it, but I made it into a more accessible version, which I sometimes use to actually do anthropological work and analyze communication from scientists. So when I study them, I look at what they think, what they say, and what they do, and whether there are disruptions. When there are disruptions, we find very interesting inconsistencies. So this kind of study is important because if you want for communication to be meaningful, of course what you say, what you think, and what you do needs to be aligned. Now, what I would like to say is that there's a difference between a focus on effective communication, very often we're very centered on doing it effectively, is something different than meaningful communication. And I will use a visual metaphor to show the difference. So if you think of the green desert, a green desert is not green growing in a desert. It's also not a desert becoming more green. This is actually a green desert. And when you see it close by, it's difficult, but if you go a bit further away, you kind of get the drift of what it is. It's actually a monocrop forest. So it is a forest, but it's the same kind of tree. It's also used for economic purposes. It's very neatly planned and controlled, and there's a whole management system of cutting and growing, which looks very different from a regular forest, which actually looks like this. And if you put them together, you see a big contrast. And this shows that there are many different ways of doing the same thing. Now these trees in such a monocrop forest of the green desert, they will also be counted as trees. So in environmental stories, these kind of trees, they also count. But of course it's not the same as a regular forest where you have biodiversity, where you have life. And I think this nicely illustrates the difference between effectiveness and meaningfulness, and why this care and emotion is actually very important. So the good news is there actually is no science without emotion, despite that there's a whole history of trying to get science to be more objective. Now, why is this important? Because humans, they are beings that feel and they think. Now, while in our philosophical traditions this has been a problem that they wanted to overcome, we actually find that in Asian philosophy, for example, but also if you think in ancient Egypt, that actually this was not a problem. And I now took an example from Chinese philosophy, where you see Qin, and that's the sign of heart, and this word depicts both hearts and minds. And these two aspects, they are actually connected in a very dynamic way. And you need both of them to have some sort of energy. So this is not a dualism like you have with Descartes, where he makes a separation between mind and body. Here you actually have something that co-constitutes each other. So you need the structuring power of what Chinese would call yin, but you also need a chaotic, creative, spontaneous force of what they would call yang in ancient philosophy. So they do not oppose, and the problem is when one dominates, then there is a disruption. And that's actually a problem we see in science that's overly focused on objectivity and focused on structuring, because then you are in this kind of industrialized setting where there's only room for control and predictability and fear for the unknown. So if you think about the image I used before of the green deserts, this is also a bit of an example of the difference between the two. But also in the West, we see that there are hints that actually this is an illusion that science could be without emotion. If we think about Kuhn and Karl Popper, they actually show that the data that we praise very highly is not objective, because it does not withstand philosophical scrutiny. Popper will say that theory is always less wrong, and Kuhn, he says that data is something that is defined, and success is defined by certain paradigms. So this is also something you find with Latour, who says when he studied scientists, you see that interpretation is an emotional act, and it depends on the values, and these values will decide whether you will ignore some things as data, whether you choose it, whether you find it significant. So this means that measurement, even though this sounds really nicely and in control, it is never purely rational, because there's always a decision to be made. So this kind of changes the image of science, which we then try to rationalize through description. And we see a few of attempts. So when Kuhn introduced this subjectivity in science in 1962, it caused quite a stir. And after that, when scientists started to realize that they were all in paradigms, that was structuring their work, deciding what they were seeing, what was limiting their work, there have been attempts to rationalize this. And for example, you see in sociology and anthropology that people have to describe the position they would inscribe themselves in their research into. These are all ways of using description and inquiring ways of, despite being emotion present, trying to neatly put it in a box and try to control it in a certain way. Then, a final thinker I would like to mention is Carl Jung, who had a lot of interesting thoughts regarding emotions. He's a psychologist from background, well, a psychiatrist, and but he also explored a lot in the world. He was also very much acquainted with philosophy, and he described emotions maybe a bit differently than we do or think about it. So he says that actually we can maybe think of a compass. So there are 4 functions of the mind, and you have 2 that are rational, and they help us to judge. And these 2 rational judging mechanisms, they are feeling and thinking, so both of them. And then you also have what we would call irrational perceiving, so things that help us obtain. And this is a sensation that we get through the senses, and intuition, which is unconscious. Now he says a balanced person should cultivate all 4. It's very problematic if you only focus on one. And also interesting is that for him, feeling is not the same as emotion. With Jung, emotion actually is the driver behind the 4. He calls this libido energy, and it's actually the flow that animates each function. So emotion is the driving force also behind thinking and behind feeling. So if emotions are repressed, then you get all sorts of distortions. This would imply that thinking becomes cold, that feeling becomes sentimental, that intuition becomes disillusional, and sensation that it becomes compulsive. So for Jung, it's important not to be taming them, like we saw with Plato, how others have tried to do it, but he thought it was very important to learn how to cultivate them. And this is the same thing as we, for example, saw in this example from Chinese philosophy as well. So it's also not surprising that Carl Jung was actually very much acquainted with these Eastern philosophies as well. So now that we have discussed this, maybe we can think about this concept of a scientific discipline. So I already told before, scientific disciplines, we very often even frame them as logos with reason and words. But what actually is a scientific discipline? And now we are actually put with 2 choices. On the one hand, a discipline could be something more in the sense of, like Jung would say, where it's a refinement of emotional energy, of what he would call eros, into something higher of love. And this love could be the pursuit of wisdom, of beauty, so higher forms. And it's actually something you cultivate in harmony within the self. This is something that's done very strictly into what disciplines are today, and it's actually more in a sense like Foucault uses it, where you have like a lot of control. It has to be predictable, it has to be efficient, knowledge and power intertwined, and education and sciences are some sort of specialization and productivity. So very two different ways of thinking what a scientific discipline is about. So this brings me to a final thought on that a lot of these problems regarding emotion and science actually are very much in line with the institutionalization of science. And you have two historical perspectives on science. The one we're most acquainted with is that science is actually something very modern. So then there's actually some sort of an assumption that there's a gap between the expert and the public. It's something you are trained in. It's actually something that took shape after the universities actually emerged. So very linked to the scientific methods. On the other hand, you could also say that science is actually as old as human civilization itself, and that, for example, people who drew cave paintings maybe were documenting their own culture. If you think of botanical drawings, these are all people we would not consider as experts or specialists, but these were also people who, sometimes based on intuition or feeling, started visualizing, start exploring, start observing, and also practicing science. If we start from that point of view, science is a very different activity, and one where there are not so many conflicts between science and emotions. But unfortunately today we still find like this contrast. So as I discussed Jung's model before, so feeling, thinking and sensing and intuition, they are actually important and should work together. But what we see today in science is that thinking actually is very computation oriented. Sensing is very much about measuring, and you could maybe argue that for measuring that you have to use the senses, but very often we actually use technology to measure, so it's not a very sensorial activity anymore. Feeling is something we actually need to manage, and intuition is something that we now use models to predict for. So very different ways of thinking about knowledge and doing research. So if you put them together, you see once again this contrast between the green desert and the regular forest. So should science be without emotion? And this is my last question for you. And you can, as with the previous rounds, pick one that represents how you perceive it, and discuss it with your mate.
These are the representations of science without emotions, or... Oh, okay.
So, should science be without emotion?
It's a representation of a question.
Yeah. Or if it's a difficult question, you could ask yourself, what would science be without emotions, that you think about consequences. Okay, who picked the first one? Okay, please.
Just me?
Yes.
But because you see two lovers in front of a sunset, and there's someone, a scientist, which says that it's just a matter of chemistry, not emotions. So.
Okay, and do you consider that a problem or not?
Yes, because it's a cold stance at existence.
Okay. Who picked the second one? Okay, please tell me.
I think the whole that there is like the unknown things and that we discover it, and then the boxes that are there are like science. I don't know how to explain it.
It was maybe intuitively that you were drawn to it. That's good. Jung calls this also a type of knowledge.
It's hard to describe it without emotion because I put the emotions like directly. So I think the boxes are not going like deep. So the science is not going deep here. And then there is a person there that tried to get the science, so the box, but is not sure that everything is possible.
Okay.
I don't know.
It's a good explanation. Yeah. Anybody else who picked two for a different reason?
I think it could show dangers of science building something without morality supporting it, and how emotions are necessary.
Okay. Anybody who also picked two for a different reason?
I do not say that much, so I'm not sure about if I interpretation right. I believe it's a way to like bury all the messy things and just have a straight line, like science without emotion. It kind of bury a lot of things that are important, just because they're believed to be messy. Quite it's similar to yours.
Okay, thank you. Who thinks is the third? Who picked the third one?
Because I think it represents a lack of real understanding. Science become a black box that you're trying to understand, but without grasping the real sense of it.
Okay. Somebody else who picked three for a different reason? No? Who picked the fourth? Nobody. Okay. Well, actually, so I've been discussing about science and emotions, and that there's no science without emotion, but actually that's also a bit what these images have been doing, because because of the images, you have to interpret these images, and you actually have to use different means of thinking about things, also using your intuition, giving meaning to it, interpreting it. So it's actually a confrontation that you actually, when you have to think and have to depict meaning, that it's not all just a rational activity. So it was also, the form is also a bit a part of the reflection. Now, a final metaphor. Very often when we think of science and specialization, we use this metaphor of the ivory tower. And this actually makes me think of when we start with Plato, where you want to reach to the gods, to the higher atmosphere, the very high form of reason. Well, if you think about it, on this ivory tower, it's actually a very flattering image where you're very far away from the lived world, very close to the gods, and you have a really big overview of everything. But maybe if we would think of it differently, that if we would reduce science to purely objectivity and disregard emotion, then maybe a better metaphor would not be an ivory tower where you are in higher regions, but actually that you're in a well and that you actually have a very limited worldview that's actually structured around the surroundings of your well. So this is a plea towards more a science of wholeness, but actually I think in this group everybody actually saw a lot of importance in emotions, because when I told people I was going to talk about there is no science without emotion, they thought it was actually a very provocative term. But I also told people I think it's more of a provocative term to say science shouldn't have emotion. So well, that was my take on this anyway. So if you are interested in all these philosophers that I refer to, here is an overview that you can read a bit more about. And that was my talk for today.
Thank you, Priscilla. It was really interesting and original presentation. Questions or short comments in English or in Italian? Tanya?
I was wondering if we were to have this kind of seminar in a class of scientists, would the output be the same? Like, would they answer the same answers we gave?
Definitely not.
Scientists, you mean natural scientists?
Natural scientists, of course.
I also use these images for other lectures as well. For example, on science communication, I always notice that depending on the training people have and the disciplinary culture they have, they depict very different meaning to these images, where some people see problems, some people see really positive things. So it really depends on the group. But it's, in that sense, images are also a very nice way of doing research, because they are facilitators to learn a bit more about a subculture.
I have a question about, it's a very simple question actually. Is this image of science as suppression of emotions partly inevitable with the professionalization of science?
Yes.
Because if we look at the, at the epic history of science until the early 20th century, we have a lot of examples of scientists describing their emotions. For example, Einstein mentions the happiest thought of my life as the thinking of somebody who doesn't feel the weight falling down, was the start of his thinking about general relativity. But even later, James Watson, when he saw the famous photo 51, he said his heart started to beat in his autobiography. But of course, science started as a vocation, as something that people were sort of inspired to a profession of 7 million people around the globe. So is that partly inevitable?
Yeah, I think there's also a connection with like the increasing industrialization, where I think there's kind of like this synergy where you have more and more focus on efficiency. You use the word professionalization, but maybe I would define it more in words of productivity and efficiency, where you have to be very efficient in reaching things and very in line with how machines actually work. So I definitely think there's a link with this.
Especially in human science. There's not there is that with the industrialization of the academy, we kind of move the interpretational paradigm that the academy used to study human complexity and reducing it and driving it in a different direction, especially because science is the main god in our society, in Occidental society, or in a secularized society. You know, my question is strange, I should have formulated better, but I hope you understand.
I'm not sure what the question is.
The question is if it's something good to industrialize knowledge, or if it, especially in the human field, or if it should be better to get back to, not really get back, but to improve the emotions, even in the professionalized side.
Yeah, that's also why I use the green forest, because the green desert, because for me this is actually where we're heading to with an idea. Well, a green desert, it is a very efficient way of planting new forests, and it's a win-win, but it has a cost. And I really think that this is not a good direction to go to. And it also leads to a lot of problems. I mean, we're also humans. Meaning is important. And I don't know if it's possible to take a step back, because we have like all these machine developments, and now also with the AI. But maybe with these developments we will have to look for new ways of bringing it back into our lives. But I think I really hope that it can be changed. And I really think it's troublesome that, for example, in humanities and social sciences, that this also becomes more and more present. Like in disciplines where you would not expect it. I even notice it in disciplines like philosophy. To give an example, when I studied philosophy 15 years ago, it even had a very different culture from today, because I went to the same institutes, the older professors, they all retired, and it's a new culture, and there's a very new, different focus. Like now everything is very oriented towards how good you can analyze certain philosophers, how could you interpret them. While in the time when I still studied it, it was very much oriented also in having like this kind of discussions, your own thoughts on the matter, and now you're an expert when you really can say Heidegger, this is his vision. So even in these kind of disciplines, I think that's the same mechanism. That's also part of that. So.
Really like the ontological tour, not sure about the anthropology, Brown, Marcus, etc. I'd love to see them spread all around the university main park. Thanks.
Another question, when we are talking about science communication, of course we have scientists, or experts or communicators, and citizens. What about citizens' emotions in science communication, according to your research and what you know on the topic?
Well, I find it interesting that when we talk about science communication to peers, it has to be really descriptive and dry and very difficult to make also very big impression. When it's oriented to the public, very often it's actually oriented to play into the emotions of people. So then it's actually very instrumental, I think. And then it's how you can make it resonate with things that people feel, and very often with the idea that through their emotions you can let them rethink things.
Yes, I think also there is a question of which emotions do you appeal to, because in many science events, I remember, for example, I was once involved in the European Science Forum, ESOF, and the slogan was passion for science. So science communication often appeals to emotions that are positively associated with science. Passion, enthusiasm, curiosity. But then, of course, there are the emotions that science communication would like to reject, like fear, for example. So being afraid of technology is not considered a good thing. But that is also an emotion.
True, there's a selection of these things.
Other questions or comments?
About the presentation, about well, made a communicated question about the presentation. Did you make the drawings?
I didn't draw.
I asked the same question.
No, I work together with somebody who draws, but we really sit a lot together to come up with these concepts, because they need to be ambiguous enough, and they need to be pointing towards an issue that cannot be too clear, but also that you even can interpret something positive in it. So it's like a very, they look simple, but there have been a lot of iterations in them to make them stronger. They also have been redeveloped a bit over me using them.
So you instructed the drawer to keep this ambiguity between positive and negative sensations.
Yeah. I actually was inspired in doing something like this because I discovered a game called Dixit. And I thought it was it's very powerful that with an image you can deploy different narratives. And what I found, I often use it to discuss issues in science communication, and these are a lot of sensitive issues. But if people start engaging in dialogue about it, and through an image, it is all of a sudden not that sensitive anymore. And it also kind of builds bridges, because I don't use them like this. I actually do it in a game form, and I present all four. And for example, in science communication, I have a round and I say, I don't buy it. And I show 4 cards, and they have to pick a number they think I chose. And they have to agree with 4. So then they have to negotiate, and then they are confronted with that some of them interpret it positive or negative and have very different ideas on issues in science communication. So it's a very good facilitator of dialogue and thinking together. And then it's also interesting for me, because then I learn like what lives with people. Like the same way as now when I ask this question about machines and thinking, and if they do a better job, you know, it's a good way of see what lives with people and what they think about it. And like here, everybody was very sensitive to it, but I mean, there are groups where people are very positive about this, so. I also like in the beginning with the image that somebody said with the image with the scientist in the garden, that it made them think of care. Because also in some settings, it's actually the opposite of care, where people associate it actually with something bad, where you start dissecting the lived world to fit your laboratory, for example. So I really liked it that I now heard somebody say like care or also patience. So it's really very different depending on who you are asking and what they perceive as being issues or take for granted.
Also because the sun doesn't look very happy.
Yes. Yeah, but that's the thing. If you start looking at them longer and longer, your perception may also change.
Any more questions or comments? No? Okay, so thank you, Priscilla. We have